Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm here with 5 cards, 1 kit using the April 2020 card kit by Simon Says Stamp, and we're going to jump right into the first card. These cards are all very, very simple. To be quite honest with you, I struggled with this kit a little bit more than I normally do with the Simon kits, so these are all very, very simple. So I'm taking a piece of the pattern paper and I equally cut around all 4 sides to make this to be, it was 5 1/4 by 4, so a little bit smaller than an A2 size card, but I still wanted all those spatters to equally show. So I kind of just measured that out so that it was kind of an equal border. I layered that onto a piece of black cardstock cut just a little bit larger, but it's still a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. That way I have a little bit of a black border and a little bit of a white border. Now, in order to make that black really pop, I'm also going to use a black glaze jelly roll pen, which is basically a gel pen that adds a little bit of dimension. So the ink takes even longer to dry than a typical gel pen. So you can see that I'm kind of just going around the edge of where all the other spatters are, and I'm kind of just adding dots. They can be all different sizes. They can be oddly shaped. It doesn't really matter. Once I get around there, I'm going to take my finger and kind of smear some of them so that they don't look like perfect dots. Some of them still will, but some of them will kind of look like the spatters that are part of the pattern paper itself. So for the sentiment, I am going to take another piece of the black cardstock, treating that with my anti-static tool, and then taking one of the sentiments from the stamp set from the kit, lining that up onto my acrylic block there, and then I will stamp that out with some Versamark ink, sprinkle on some white embossing powder, which also comes in the kit, but I didn't bother to open it being I already have one open. And then I will cut this down into a skinny strip that is the same width as the card itself. Pop that up with some foam tape and finished off with a few Nuvo glitter drops. These are white blizzard. They're basically clear with just a whole lot of shimmer to them. And that is it for card number 1. For the second card, I'm going to bring out the stencil that is part of the kit. And this cloud stencil is a little bit unique because it doesn't only have the borders on all 4 sides, but it also has the clouds in the center. Now, I know that the kit was supposed to include 4 hybrid inks by Simon Says Stamp, but I know that sometimes there has to be replacements if they run out. And I know with this whole quarantine and shelter in place thing that's going on, there was probably some things that didn't go exactly according to plan. So I got a few Gina K Designs dye inks, which I'm actually happy with because I prefer dye inks over hybrid inks, and I love these colors. They do not have names of the colors on there, but it's a pink, a yellowish color, and kind of like a turquoise, and then a blue. So I am just using the border here of the stencil, and I'm just doing nothing special. You guys have seen this done a million times, but you can see that I'm working on a scrap piece of paper, and there's openings in the stencil for the actual clouds. Well, I'm not very careful when I do my ink blending. So what I'm doing is I'm using an extra scrap piece of paper, and this is just printer paper, and I'm putting that underneath my stencil so that when I go beyond the border, which I typically do, I don't get any of that ink onto my card panel. It's just going on that scrap piece of paper. So I'm working sort of kind of in rainbow order. So I started with the pink, then the yellow, then that turquoise greenish color, and then I will finish off with the blue, and then I just repeated that. Now these dye inks do blend fairly nicely. I mean, it doesn't blend quite as well as distress inks or distress oxides, but I didn't really have too much of a problem. What I tended to do is go in with a very, very light hand. You can see that I'm tapping off on my scrap piece of paper each and every time, and then I kind of go in where the cloud kind of dips in. I kind of go in with just the tip of my brush, and I'm using a Trinity Stamps Blending Buddy brush, which comes to a point, so it makes it a little bit easier, just to darken up those shadows a little bit. So like I said, once I reached the blue, I went ahead and continued down and added all 4 colors once again, did the same exact thing with that scrap piece of paper. Now, this looks beautiful as is. I love when people do this with their cards. I don't typically do it just because I forget, but I wanted to add a little bit something extra. And I have these white Blizzard Nouveau glitter drops sitting on my desk still, so I figured I'm going to add these to the background and add just a little bit of sparkle to my clouds. So once all of the ink blending was done, I am going to take this stencil. I did clean it off with a towel. You can really clean it if you want, but I didn't bother to do that because you guys know I'm pretty lazy. So I am going to line this stencil back up. It's pretty easy to line up as long as you have it in the right direction. I did have to flip mine over. It took me a few minutes, but I finally got it. Line that back up, and I'm going to add a few drops where the cloud dips in, same place as I put my shadows. And then I'm just going to take my finger and kind of rub that up onto the cardstock. And I'm just going to go all the way down, and I'm going to do this with each and every cloud or each and every color that we put down. And this is just going to add a little bit of shimmer where one cloud starts and the other one ends, if that makes any sense. And it is pretty hard to see on camera. Hopefully you guys can see it in the final photos, but it does really add a lot to your background. So you will want to make sure that you let this dry. It didn't take that long because it's such a thin layer, probably about 15 or 20 minutes or so. And once that is done, you also want to clean that stencil off immediately. So I went ahead and trimmed down this panel just a little bit so that I have a little bit of a border around my card base. I like to have a border, you guys know that. For my sentiment, I am going to stamp this onto vellum because I want the clouds to be pretty much the entire card. I'm using my work surface to make sure that the 2 sentiments line up nicely, treating my vellum with my anti-static tool once again, stamping that out with the Versamark ink, sprinkling on some white embossing powder and heat setting that and trimming that down. And again, this is going to be kind of a strip that goes across the entire card panel because I figured that would be the easiest way to do it. And you can still see everything underneath the vellum. Now, for vellum, you can always see that adhesive sticking through. So the white heat embossed area is where I am going to put my adhesive because you're not going to be able to see through it. The embossing powder is opaque, so you're not going to be able to see any adhesive that you put on there. But you still have those edges that are going to stick out the sides that you clearly going to need adhesive for because it's just not going to stick down and it's going to get stuck in an envelope. So what I ended up doing is I ended up putting just a couple of drops of the Nouveau, or no, I didn't. I lie. The Tombow Mono Multi Glue, because I prefer to use wet glue, where I planned on putting the Nouveau drops. Because that's going to hide, the Nouveau drops are going to hide the adhesive if it shows through. So I just added a few drops to either side, stuck that down onto my card panel, and then I had to kind of mess around a little bit or kind of tilt the card panel a little bit to actually see where I put the glue drops because they were still wet. Once they dry, you can see them, but when they're still wet, it's kind of hard to see. But I just covered those up with those same Nouveau glitter drops, and that is it for card number 2. Moving on to the third card, I'm taking a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm just cutting this down into a strip. I'm going to be just using this friend sentiment from the stamp set, and I'm going to be using 6 different color inks, all by Simon Says Stamp. These are the dye inks. Like I said, that's what I prefer, but that is totally personal preference. Now I'm going to be using my Misty here because I'm going to repeat stamp this many, many, many times. And I've done this in a couple of videos before, but I will keep some of it in case you didn't see those videos. So I'm going to start by lining up my card panel here, or my piece of cardstock, and then line up my sentiment right there on the very top. Close my Misty door, and I use the grid lines on my Misty door to make sure that it is completely straight. And then I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out with my first colored ink. Stamp that down, clean off that stamp, and you will want to make sure that your stamp is dry before moving on to the next color. You'll see that I kind of rub my finger over it before moving on to the next color just to make sure it is completely dry. Now, when I move this card panel up, I'm kind of closing my Misty door to make sure that the sentiment is evenly spaced. And then I'm just paying attention to the measurements on the side. You can eyeball it I eyeball it most of the time, but with a sentiment, I like to actually measure. So I'm just using the measurements on the side of the MISTI to make sure that each and every time that I stamp this out, it is evenly spaced. Now, as you can see, I'm using rainbow colors because that's the whole theme of this kit. And once I get down to the purple, which I think I used deep purple, I believe it was, but you'll see in a minute. I'll link it all below. I'll link all of these colors below. I'm going to start with that red again. Now, you can see as I move my paper up, I'm going to kind of hang off my MISTI. I know that's kind of off camera a little bit, but that's okay. As long as you don't add too much pressure when you're actually stamping, you won't crease your cardstock. Just don't add too much pressure. You'll see that when I close my MISTI door and actually stamp out the image, I kind of just leave it there for a couple of seconds. Let that ink soak into the paper. That way I don't have to worry about adding too much pressure. As long as you add even pressure, you're going to get a great stamped image. So finishing off with this last friend here, and then I'm going to assemble my card. Once again, I'm going to take one of the pieces of pattern paper from the kit, and I am going to, again, trim this down to a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. It is 5 1/4 by 4 once again. And I'm kind of doing this the same way to make sure that I have all of the colors of the rainbow in that pattern paper to make sure that they're all showing. And then again, taking another piece of the black cardstock, cutting that slightly larger than my card panel, and then taking another piece of black cardstock and just cutting it a little bit wider than that strip that we actually stamped on. So to assemble this, super, super easy. Going to adhere my pattern paper down to that black mat of cardstock and then adhere that down to an A2 size note card. You'll notice that I mat a lot of my panels onto a piece of black cardstock with just a little bit of it showing. To me, this really makes everything pop, and especially with these rainbow colors, it really, really makes it pop. So for the black strip here, I went ahead and adhered this down, but realized that my black mat from my main panel is a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. So I had to kind of sneak my scissors in there to snip off a little bit of it rather than removing it and trying to use my paper trimmer when there's adhesive still on it. That wouldn't have been good. So I just very carefully snipped a little bit of that off. Now this pattern paper is a little bit smooth, so the wet glue doesn't stick to it immediately. You have an extra couple of seconds to work with it. But again, I did the same thing with the white panel. Didn't trim that down either. But being this is regular cardstock, being adhered to regular cardstock, it stuck pretty much immediately. And I wasn't able to get my scissors in there, and I didn't want to take the chance and do all that stamping all over again. So I left it exactly as is. So that is card number 3. Next, we'll move on to card number 4. I am using one of the watercolor, I can't remember what they're called, but again, I'll link it below, the watercolor panels that are part of the kit. And for the background, I am doing some watercoloring with Distress Oxides, but I will be coloring my images with Copic markers. So I'm going to use, I have some water off to the side there, and I'm dampening my paper. I'm adding quite a bit of water to the larger areas, and I'm using Blueprint Sketch, Broken China, and Salty Ocean. So I'm using the Blueprint Sketch towards the top, then the Salty Ocean, and then the Broken China on the bottom. And all of these colors are a little bit farther enough away from each other where it kind of gives you a nice blend, but not too far where it looks a little wonky. So I'm working with this small area at first, and then I'll move on to the larger area. So I'm going to wet the top portion of my panel, and I am sort of being careful not to go over my image itself, but I'm not coming too close with the water, because once I put the pigment down, once I put this ink down, then I can use that paintbrush to kind of make sure that it's getting real close to the image. Of course, there were some areas that it went over, but I can always fix those later. And especially being this is going to dry back, I'm not really too concerned about it. I'm going to be coloring over it, and more than likely, you're not going to notice it. So next, moving on, adding a little bit more water to the panel and adding that salty ocean. And I'm just making sure that that salty ocean kind of blends with that blueprint sketch a little bit. And it looks crazy right now. And you may need to go back in and add a little bit more water, or add a little bit more pigment to get these colors to blend and mesh well together. But that's fine. That's what watercolor does. And keep in mind that once watercolor dries, not only does it dry back, as in it lightens, it's going to look completely different than it does wet. And that's kind of why I like watercolor. I struggle with watercolor, but I like watercolor backgrounds. Anybody can do backgrounds, so that's kind of what I stick to. But I like the fact that I don't know what it's going to look like once it's dry. And I'm always usually pretty surprised the way it looks. So finishing off here with the broken china on the top, once I had everything blended and all these little areas kind of filled in, I did feel like the top wasn't quite dark enough. So I went back in and added a little bit more water and a little bit more of that blueprint sketch on the top and kind of just worked that to make it blend a little bit better with the salty ocean. Now I let this air dry. Totally up to you if you want to use your heat tool to kind of speed up the process. I prefer to let my watercolor panels air dry because I find that I get less warping. I didn't tape this down. You can tape it down, but totally up to you. A couple ways you can flatten it down if you do have a lot of warping is you can put it under something heavy for a little while or run it through your die cutting machine. Same sandwiches you would use for a die cut, just don't obviously add the die cut. Run that through a couple of times and it should flatten out your panel nicely. So once that's dry, I'm going to move on to the Copic coloring. And I kept it pretty simple, and you'll notice that, well, you may notice. If you've watched my videos before, you'll notice. I'm not going in with the lightest color first, which is what I typically do. I usually go in with the lightest color, map out my darkest areas, get the paper saturated so that my colors blend nicely. But in this case, I didn't do that because it's watercolor paper. And although you can color on watercolor paper with alcohol markers, I tend to get a lot of bleeding. It is textured, so it's going to give you a little bit different of a look if rather than, you know, coloring on Nina or any other Copic safe paper. So I started right with my darkest color. I did have a few areas where I didn't get the best blend in the world, but being we have a watercolor background, I'm really not worried about looking realistic, I should say. So I colored the skin tones for both of this little girl and little boy the same way. For her, I'm going to give her some dark hair, and for him, I'm going to give him some red hair. And I always start with my darkest color for hair anyway, because I like to keep that texture. I use some flicking motions, and I like to really keep that texture. However, with the watercolor paper, you're more than likely going to lose a lot of your texture regardless of how little you actually blend. It's just the type of paper that it is, but it is what it is. So while I'm finishing up coloring here, I do want to let you guys know, in case you haven't already heard, and in case you are a subscriber to the Simon Says Stamp Card Kit, there will not be an a May kit. Some of you probably know, most of you probably know that Simon Says Stamp had to temporarily close down their warehouse due to the shelter-in-place order in the state of Ohio. They are back open. They are shipping. Just keep in mind that they probably got a ton of orders while they were closed, even though I think they were only closed like 2 or 3 weeks. They have a lot of orders to catch up on. I know that I got my order very, very quickly after they reopened, but they are skipping the May kit. There is a Mother's Day kit, a special edition one or a limited edition one, but subscribers will not get that kit. They would have to place an order separately for that. And quite honestly, I don't even know if they're sold out or not. I'm kind of at a spending freeze like most of us. So back to the coloring here, you can see that moving on to the umbrella, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading with some cool gray markers on the top and bottom, because this would be more of a rounder object. It's not a circle, but it has some roundness to it. So I'm keeping a really strong center highlight. I am going to fill in those dots on the umbrella at the end, but for just have their little outfits to go. I'm going to be using some RV markers for her. And you can see that I had a little bit of bleeding here, which is no surprise for RV markers. But for some reason, my RV 25, something happened to the nib. It looks like an animal chewed on it. It's so weird. I don't know what happened to it, but I'm trying to work with it the best I can. I don't have any spare nibs, so it is what it is. I have a little bit of bleeding. We're going to deal with it. Going to use the black marker as well as some cool gray markers for their little shoes. And then for his shirt, I'm going to move on to some greens. You can obviously see that I have the coloring process sped up by quite a bit, and I will speed it up again later on in the video just because it takes a long time and this video is already super long. So I figured if you wanted to skip through it, it's a lot easier to skip through just a couple of minutes. So next I am going to add a little bit of shading to her little ruffles there on her dress, but I wanted to add a shadow underneath each one of them. So I'm still going to use those cool gray markers. I'm also using a light blue marker to fill in any gaps where my Distress Oxides didn't get all the way close enough to the images themselves. For their shadows underneath them, I'm going to add just a little bit of the C5, and I'm not worried about a light source here. I'm just kind of blobbing this color down, blending that out with the C3, and then filling in this entire ground area with the C1. Now, to bring in this whole rainbow theme, I am going to take a variety of different markers. I'm not doing any shading, just one red, one orange, one yellow, you get it. And I am going to, at first, I tried to lighten up some of these hearts by just adding some plain water and then dabbing them up with a paper towel. They did lighten up a little bit, but it wasn't enough where I was going to bother to do all of them. So I just colored over them. So for the little dots on the umbrella, as well as these little hearts in the background that are like little heart raindrops, I am just going to kind of scatter my rainbow colors all around. And I'm just kind of concentrating the darkest colors being on the hearts that are towards the top of the card panel because they are significantly darker up there. So I didn't bother to put any yellows up there or anything like that, but it just continued on with a variety of different colors. Doesn't really matter which colors you use, just as long as you have all of the colors of the rainbow. So once all of my coloring was complete, I am going to go ahead and add a sentiment to my card panel. I didn't bother to do really anything else with this. I didn't bother to even cut it down. I just adhered this to my white A2 size note card. For my sentiment, I'm using obviously a sentiment from that same stamp set, and I'm going to stamp this down with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there in the top left-hand corner. And then I finished off with a little bit of shimmer with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen, and again, those Nuvo glitter drops. I'm trying to use minimal supplies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So that is it for card 4. Moving on to the 5th and final card, I'm going to take this large image from the stamp set. I'm using a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to stamp this with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. And you can see that I'm not stamping the entire images. I kind of left her shoes off the page. I'm going to do a little bit of no line coloring here. And again, I'm going to start with my lightest color because this is Nina paper and this is made for coloring. So I can kind of layer up my colors without worrying about them bleeding. Again, this is going to be sped up a lot because I don't think that you just want to sit through all of this. So a couple of days ago, or maybe even about a week ago, I posted a poll on my YouTube channel as well as my Facebook group, which I'll link the Facebook group below too in case you're interested in joining. And my question was, because I watch a lot of kit videos, there's a lot of kit videos out there with all different kits. What do you guys want to see? Do you want me to kind of keep my supplies limited to just maybe a few things outside of the kit and mainly just focus on the content of the kit? Or do you just want me to use everything? And a majority of you said keep it limited, which I prefer to do when I'm kind of showing a kit and what you can do with the kit. If I brought in all of the materials from my craft room, having the kit is kind of pointless, or because you're using everything outside of the kit. So as you can see, I did bring in some things like the Nuvo drops and things like that, but I'm using them in pretty much every card. So I'm getting the most out of the few supplies that I did bring in. So next time I do a kit video, which will be probably the next Simon Says Stamp kit, I'll bring in other things. I'll bring in any and everything. And then you guys can let me know which one you prefer. Obviously, these cards for this kit are very, very simple. I struggled with the kit and I didn't bring in a lot. I brought in very few things outside of the kit. So we'll see what you guys like better. And that's what we'll go with. So moving on to some V markers here for her dress. I'm just paying attention to the lines that are within the image that kind of show the creases in her dress. I didn't bother to do any shading on her belt. I just used my black marker for that. And then I'm going to use the same skin tones as I did for the other card, but you can see by starting off with that lightest color and by using the Nina Solar White, I got a much better blend. It looks a little bit better than on that watercolor paper. Also added a little dash where her little knees would be, or the back of her knees, I guess. So once all of my coloring was complete, I went ahead and die cut this panel down with a large stitched rectangle die by Simon Says Stamp. That's always a tongue twister for me. I can never get that out. Tape that down with some Post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around when going through my die cutting machine. And then I am going to layer this onto a piece of the, I think it's called Island Blue cardstock. It's the one from the kit. I just cut that just a little bit larger. If you guys have the Simon Says Stamp stitched rectangle dies, I cut this to 5 1/4 by 4, and the stitched rectangle die is just a little bit smaller than that. And again, this will act as the same as the black mat. It will just really make my card panel pop. Layered this onto my white A2 size card base. Then I kind of played around with the sentiment a little bit. Wasn't really sure what to do. I wanted to keep this very simple, so I ended up just taking 2 of the sentiments from the stamp set, pop those up onto my acrylic block. I'm really having a hard time talking today, guys. And then stamp that out with that same Island Blue ink, same one as we used for the friend card, and obviously it matches the cardstock. Now, you guys always wonder why I use an acrylic block. Taking my chances here, and you can see that I did smudge it, but it's not the end of the world. I can use a white gel pen to kind of fill in some of those areas. I also filled in the thank you with that B01, which is my lightest B marker that I used in the umbrella, and that will kind of hide the fact that it smeared a little bit. And then I'll just take my white gel pen to fix up that O in that bottom portion of the sentiment. No big deal. Finished off with a little bit of shimmer with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer Pen, and that is it for card number 5. So here is a quick look at all 5 cards that we created with the Simon Says Stamp April 2020 kit. As always, I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.